Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're good. Now, some of you pleased, some of you disappointed that we still can't play videos on this. It seems to not be working properly. So I can't give you the blaring music and the fancy intro. And so you've just got me. But I keep forgetting to put my little thing. I feel naked until I put this up. There we go. That feels a bit better. So, hi, I'm Jack, and we do a Chewing It Over from 12:30 till 1 o'clock on weekdays, and I have some guest hosts on Tuesdays, which have been fantastic. So if you didn't catch Leanne Antoine's session on, she was with my friend Ash James on Tuesday, and I just caught up with that this morning. It was absolutely brilliant episode, so do check that out. Our guest hosts now joining on Tuesdays have been doing a great job. But one of the things that I've had planned for a little while now is to speak to Ellie Somers, who's an American physiotherapist who posted some tweets that really sort of made me challenge my thinking and sort of like, I think I also recognized some of my own instincts and thinking like, I think I disagree with that. And then I thought, actually, no, I don't. There's clearly loads more to this beneath the tweet. And so let's speak about it. And so I DM'd her and she was kind enough to grant us some time. And by the way, it's like 5 a.m. or something in the US. So I feel super guilty for dragging her out of bed. But the subject matter is so important. Now, coincidentally, we've had this plan for a little while, but coincidentally, it's the week of which we've got a lot of shows to this effect this week, because it's obviously on Monday, it was International Women's Day. So we had a great session with Lucy Macdonald about sexism in MSK and some of the experiences of discrimination that she's faced, as well as a conversation tomorrow with Jo Turner that brings it together in and around sort of some of the other more complex gender questions. But Ellie speaks really well to this notion of why are there such relevant statistical disparities, particularly in sport, and just ahead of the show, we've just been talking about the fact that then overlaps sometimes within business as well, which is what Lucy spoke to so well on Monday. So hopefully all the technology is behaving itself and working. Please let me know if you can hear okay in the chat and get stuck in and get involved. Don't be shy on that, because this is very much about participation and for you to get your questions out to Ellie. And so please do let me know on the chat, both whether or not the tech's working and behaving itself, but also how you can get stuck in and involved in what is an important subject. So as long as the technology behaves itself, I will, in a couple of clicks, bring you Ellie Somers. Ellie, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. All the way across the pond, as we say. Thank you for such an early morning. What time is it over there now?
Dare I say, it's 4:30 a.m.
I said 5, and how strong's the coffee? So hugely appreciated. And the first thing you said when I thanked you for that this morning is it's an important enough topic to get stuck into. And so I really appreciate that, because I agree. Could you just introduce yourself for the audience and the roles that you have at the moment?
Yeah, so my name is Ellie Somers, and I'm a physical therapist in Seattle, and I run a small private practice called SISU Sports Performance and Physical Therapy, where I offer run coaching and strength and conditioning and physiotherapy. And then I'm also the team physical therapist for the United States Australian Rules football team, the women's team. So day to day, that's the stuff that I'm doing: programming and helping people in pain, and helping the team athletes.
Fantastic. Now, as I mentioned in the intro briefly, there were a couple of tweets of yours that I think one of the first things that I'd seen your name attached to, admittedly for me, which was really exciting how much it confronted me. And then, as I said, it made me realize like I'd love to talk about this further, and who better than the person that wrote it? And I'll just pull those tweets up, and so those of you that can see this. And so for those that are listening after the fact on audio podcast, I'll read it out for you, but we're just putting this up on screen. It is my belief that there is no shortage of qualified women who want to work in pro sports. There's a shortage of systems designed to support, encourage, develop, and welcome women so that they can. It follows up with blaming women for flawed institutionalized problems, discrimination, in pro sports is not a solution to the lack of diversity seen in those institutions. Accountability is. Now, Ellie, you got so much in 2 tweets there. Like that's one of the things that sort of set the scene for this and beyond. But firstly, could you just expand on those and what inspired those?
Yeah, so those were inspired from a post that was done by a woman in professional sports, and she was really talking about how she's been supported to get there in ways, and then also how few women actually apply for jobs and things of that nature. And the post to me came off as blaming to women, that it's our fault that we don't apply, that we don't take these chances. I think there is a bit of truth to some of that for sure. But that's what inspired the post and some of my thoughts on the post.
Fantastic. Now, when I DM'd you, it feels a while ago, doesn't it? It's probably only like a couple of months tops. But like when I DM'd you, I did say I didn't want to get you in false pretenses. I admitted that this sort of, there was plenty I agreed with there, but also there were bits where I felt like, oh, there's something I'd love to get stuck into. And one of the things there is that I wondered whether or not you feel that and also from studying a little more of your work and contributions since my approach, I've come to realize that I wondered if one of the things that you feel is that the statistical inequities that can exist between sort of the gender representation across sort of pro sports therapies, whether or not you feel that the gap between that and what would be gender parity is in of itself evidence of discrimination and the biases that can exist there. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't deny it. It's a very blaringly obvious difference how many women are involved. And I don't know the statistics there compared to men, but very clearly different. Yeah.
And then because I agree with that. I mean, it's so obvious, and certainly, you know, it's a shame we don't have the data. But if we did, it'd be very variable between countries, and also definitionally, it's difficult sometimes because, like yourself, contemporary therapists are appropriately blurring the lines between coaching and how it varies. MSK and sports sometimes used synonymously, but they're slightly different. So I think that where the interesting conversation lies, which is what your tweet spoke so powerfully to, is the why. Is where the interesting stuff is. And I don't know if it's fair for me to categorize what you described as this post that preceded yours, but Sheryl Sandberg's lean in theory being one where that is sort of, and the majority of that thesis was this notion of if females could arbitrarily become more assertive and put themselves forward more, that would bridge that gap almost in and of itself. When, that certainly for me seems a bit of a stretch to associate that in full, but almost, do you feel that actually that is being described is what the nonsense is that you're calling?
Yeah, I mean, when that book came out, I was like, oh, this is accurate. And then I think as a woman, you start to realize that that's for privileged people,
Right.
people in certain positions, and societally, I think there's a lot of conditioning that goes on for women that does make it more difficult for us to apply for certain jobs and to make certain moves or try to progress our career. Sheryl, somebody who had a good amount of money and then had also people supporting her along the way to help get her where she was going. Yeah. And in sport, I think the good old boys club, classically speaking, is very prominent and not easy for everyone to get into. And some of the comments that I received on that post on Instagram, because I shared it also on Instagram, were very much like, I was told not to apply. I was told that if I applied, they didn't want to deal with, sexual discrimination on the staff and things of that nature. And so, ironically, like there's two sides to every story, I think you could say. And in sport, the systematic kind of exclusion of women has been very real. While I think it's also improving.
And that's where I guess I wonder, is your position then that the choice related variables and the likelihood of women putting themselves forward for those roles is a feature, but not as prevalent, not as big a part of that gap as is being inferred by others? Or is it that you feel that actually it's something that doesn't exist?
Look, I think women who want to work in sport probably played sport and are probably more often than not very driven individuals who are making moves to try and get a direction. I can tell you that to get my footy job, something that I did was I sent my resume to the coach and just was like, you guys need help, I think. So here's my resume. And that's maybe like one of those examples of kind of taking it to the next level, having enough confidence to say, I think I'm worth it. I think you guys would benefit from my help. And it wasn't a year later that finally they reached out to me and were like, I think you're right. So, there's like a balance to all of it. But part of why I was so fortunate to get this role was also because I had women pulling me up and women that I knew on the team and other professionals in physiotherapy that helped push that along. And so, there's a balance. So the accountability piece is me or you or whoever making the moves to try and get there. There's also the pulling people along piece. And I think that piece in particular has not been as robust for women professionals.
And as you've said, I think you certainly can't want to or wouldn't want to excuse it, but you can sort of understand why historically for male dominated sports in participation, and obviously where a lot of the money is for other reasons, some of which overlap significantly, of course, with the institutionalized conversation we're having, but also that at that high level of sport, there's then this idea that, we'll err on the side of caution and have male therapists as a means of then it matters less if you put the table in the shower room, or you've got all these different features that mean that then organizations, just as a matter of complacency, have created barriers. And then I'm not excusing that because they should have been more thoughtful, but then similarly, even without the more overt discrimination, the systemic piece, you can so understand. And myself and my now wife, who's now a pediatric therapist who works in respiratory, so less in the MSK and sports game, but when we were both juniors, we both worked across semi-pro sport. And definitely that was something that opened my eyes to the fact that literal example whereby you go to an away game and the table is where the changing room meets the showers was something. And what was interesting to me is that she was less bothered about that than I was in many circumstances. However, the opportunity that sometimes the blokes would take to test that water, and as if to infer that it's completely normal for them to go and have their wrist strap naked by my wife, is something that those are situations that she should never have been put in. And those sorts of circumstances have definitely opened my eyes then, and I can so understand why those barriers definitely play a part in why that gap exists. When it comes to other variables in play, and where I think it sometimes gets controversial, is where there are, to my eye, relevant distinctions between what we know in the data, between the aspirations of men and women on the mean, and obviously therefore trying to understand obviously to speak clinical language for a second, like it's a biopsychosocial thing as which it's difficult to uncouple. But when we start to talk about maybe dispositional differences that are somewhat at least related to biological forces, that's where it sort of gets contentious. Because do you feel that actually they are overplayed, underplayed, don't exist, do exist? Like, how does that factor into your analysis?
Oh God, I don't know. I think probably all of it is very real and is worth just considering and asking, what are the reasons why these differences exist and in sport? And I don't know if I know how to answer that, quite frankly.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm thinking on the fly, but it's kind of, because it's complex stuff, and obviously I probably needed to prep you for a week-long answer, I guess, on something as complex as that. But I suppose I'm admitting to you that one of the things that I feel gets contentious, and I certainly will weigh into any topic as it's topical, but admittedly on something like this, I've found it that is such a fraught question, in part because people are sometimes really sensitive to only wanting to talk about sociological variables, much like we have done. But then I know that on the pelvic health show that we ran through Therapy Live last weekend, there were some great talks on the menopause, on cyclical menstrual factors that affect performance and things like that make me realize that to infer that there isn't a relevant biological component, albeit completely ridiculous to infer that that's all of it. But if we weren't to do that, actually we'd do women a disservice to not recognize that, both on a performance level as well as for therapists to make sure that they've got those opportunities. And I think that's what made me then think, well, ignoring it is actually not the answer there, and that we've got to kind of grapple with it, even though it's messy. And I suppose that's why I wondered, because I know some people and I've heard from these people, especially this week, that then say that any inference that there's relevant biological differences between men and women, again on a level, is something that is tantamount to bigotry. And I just wondered if, are you, is that a position that you hold, or do you have sympathies to that position?
No, yeah, I have sympathies to that position. I mean, I don't. There are biological differences, most certainly, but at the core of it, we still function very much the same, and we're still human beings, and so we're all subject to, the biological pieces, the social pieces, the psychological pieces, men and women. And biologically, I think when it comes to this particular conversation, I don't think our biology has any, as much to do with how we can perform in these environments as much as maybe some of the undertones of sexuality. And that seemed to be a theme of some of the comments that people were making, is like, well, we don't want to risk, a sexual harassment suit. That's a piece of it. But then there's also, of course, the other pieces of it, which is just overt discrimination or prejudice, bias. It's easier to hire a man. We don't have a women's bathroom, so which is maybe a biological thing too in ways. So
Sure.
Yeah, lots to consider, but I'm inclined to say the biological piece is maybe less of a factor in my head than the other pieces.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's kind of messed with me over the years more than at the moment, but definitely, like, as we've learned clinically, that of course biopsychosocial issues are not distinct features. These are nested within complex humans in complex social systems, and therefore of course these things are constantly evolving. I suppose one of the things that I reflect on, and this is where, of course, it's not, I am a man, but it's something that, admittedly, as I've mentioned on this show many times, I'm from a family of engineers that's then gone into healthcare, and therefore, sort of symbolically, especially on sort of, if you tested me onto empathy and compassion metrics, you find me sort of dizzy heights, and that's why I've gone into trying to help people. But you also find that because of that, I never aspired to be a traveling therapist with team sports, because I can't stand to be away from the home and my family and things like that. And I'm not, I find it to be that the traveling aspects never appealed to me. And when I've spoken to many colleagues about that, I find more kinship with my female colleagues on that than I do with men. And then that makes me wonder, of course, that's not biologically determined. However, I can, when I speak to, as a relatively new parent myself, I find that then weighed, the whole social issues around caregiving become relevant to whether or not any given man or any given woman, might you find more men out of 100 than you would women that want to travel the world. If they can't, then if the pay grade of that means they can't travel as a family, that for me means that you've got this biopsychosocial phenomena playing out. And so, it's been something I've been grappling with for a while. And I was wondered, do you, who works in that space, do you find those factors affect the sort of dynamics at all?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have children, and I think that piece of it, that the social side of things, and the pressures that women face to be primary caretakers and things of that nature are going to affect their ability to work in these positions. And yet I'm also inclined to say we still need accountability to say, well, sports supports women in that capacity. I mean, even athletes, having a baby can drop your career in an instant. And that's, that shouldn't be the case. And I think on the physio side, the clinician side, there's probably some accountability bits that need to happen on the systems to support women in those roles and make it more accessible to them. Otherwise, why would I apply? I know I'm not gonna, if I have a baby, why would I try to go into pro sports if I know that there's not going to be support for me to care for my family? Or and I don't know the solutions there necessarily, but I think there's like two sides to that. There's the side that, yes, women are, wanting to have families, wanting to take care of their kids, not wanting to travel, There's also the side that says, well, what about holding systems accountable and asking for, good maternity leave and good family care options?
Yeah, when that's where the sort of policy implications of this sort of
Right.
stuff comes in. When the conversation and the analysis is thorough enough, here's a declaration of bias from me, is that when we thorough enough with the analysis, and I'm forever saying this, put all the cards on the table and have a mature conversation about it. The policy implications of that improves and it removes some of the barriers to then the systemic features that we've talked about. They can melt away. Now, what happens to the statistics then is where the fascinating part of it is, right? Because I am admittedly skeptical that we end up in parity, because I think that I think it's just a bit more messy than that. Now, I've got one more question for you, which I'm going to come back to in a second, but we're going to go to the comments, and there's been some lovely reflections coming on the comments. But just to prep you for that, what that question will be is, can we solve this in sport, in MSK, and in our corner without the real big picture social pieces and political pieces? That's one of the things I'm going to come back to you on. It's like, can we really move the needle in our world without the big picture stuff? And I know, you're a fairly political person, so, it might open another conversation for us. But I just want to come back to you on that in a second. One of the things I love about this show, and why I'm pleased that we've continued to do it, is that I come across people in the comments section who are exactly who I've been meaning to approach to be a guest, right? So Holly White, and I'm pretty sure this will be the Holly White I'm thinking about. I've just been reading about her work. She's got a new project for sports rehabilitators and getting women involved in that conversation, which I've seen and been reading about this week. So Holly, thank you so much for commenting, but also please, if you fancy coming on the show to talk about these issues and your project, then let me know. She said, really interesting that relevant biological difference is coming up, often overlooked as it's perhaps more uncomfortable to address than the rest of the whole massive biopsychosocial picture. Is this because it perhaps more immutable and less easy? Sorry, I always found this difficult to then find the rest of it. Less easy to change and therefore has to be adjusted for other than the other parts of the puzzle. I mean, Ollie, this is exactly what I'd love to talk to you about further. I'll definitely, before I go, I'll find another comment, but I just wondered if you could comment on that, Ellie, as to whether or not you feel Ollie's onto something where that is often the harder part of it to discuss.
Yeah, I think probably that's true. And I think I could be wrong here, but again, it maybe comes back to sexuality a little bit. And there's like a lot to unpack there, but I think that probably having these discussions is important, and understanding, that you can't slap a woman on her butt when she's in the locker room. And like there are behavioral things that go with sexuality, maybe, that complicate relationships with women being in professional sports. And I don't know if that's a biological thing, like I can't quite put my finger on it, or like a social thing. But the biological piece, it's usually very obvious that, a woman is a woman. And so,
yeah,
I don't
that intersection with sexuality, I think is really interesting. I suppose if the data was more appropriately captured and carefully analyzed, then we'd maybe be able to learn some lessons there as to where maybe gender is actually a proxy for some of the sexuality variables at this level of sport and therapy that might well be more revealing than just this gender binary that we're sometimes talking about. So I think that's a really interesting point. Unfortunately, my friend and colleague Gemma Oliver has posted here and thank you for sharing this, Gemma, but I'm saying unfortunately that you had to experience this. But she said that she worked at Sheffield United Academy as a volunteer after she qualified, was told directly by a coach I would never be able to work with the first team as I was a woman, and the players would just want to sleep with me, so it'd be distracting. That speaks to something that you've mentioned earlier, really, Ellie. And as you can imagine, outpouring of support for Gem in the comments. But those sorts of features, hopefully, she's gone on to say that was a while back. I'm not for a second suggesting that the world has moved enough on this, but I mentioned on Monday that I'm hopeful that my generation and generations beyond me sort of grow up from that, because that's just embarrassing, isn't it? There's nothing more than just we need to out that behavior.
Yeah, that's very real. I had similar comments on my Instagram from people being like, I was told not to apply because they didn't want to deal with sexual harassment clauses. And I think that's what I'm alluding to with the biological piece. Like, it's very obvious a woman is a woman biologically for the most part. sexual harassment is a very real issue in sport, and within those contexts, I think that women might not be encouraged to participate in sporting environments because of that as well. So it's unfortunate, and that's accountability to me. That's an accountability piece within the system that says we do not tolerate this, period, end of sentence. If we have a woman on staff, we are taking the steps to make her supported and respect her and keep her boundaries, and we're not going to be engaging in overt sexual assault.
Some of the best therapists in the sports game will often be an integral part of the team in such a way that sometimes that professional boundary is sometimes blurred for good reason for performance. But actually, one of the downsides to that is that their identity gets blurred in such an interesting way. And because you don't have many mixed participation sports at the elite level, you end up in this funny spot whereby that female therapist becoming one of the boys can be a really useful thing in some ways, but then if they behave with her as they do with each other to some extent, I mean, at its worst, the arse slapping that occurs in a male rugby changing room, right, is something that if that then transcends to the friendship you have with said female therapist, I'm not for a second excusing it, but it's just that's where that identity and boundary issue with where the professional meets the personal and how their role and their professional behaviors within a team is something that I think to some extent we've been clumsy to blur those lines a little much. Like I think I recognize that sometimes when I think back to those days where I was more involved in team sport. There's a really interesting comment I'd love your thoughts on here from Luke Ford, who said that working in female rugby has allowed him to develop his understanding of therapy and learn more working in female sport. That's one of the ways in which I think men could probably get further insight into that and to define those roles and boundaries better. Would you advise and encourage that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm like, part of me is like, oh, women's sport is for women. I know that's not true, but
yeah.
I do think, though, this is an interesting reflection on the access that men have then also to women's sport and the differences in how a man shows up to a woman's game and with those athletes compared to a woman showing up to the man's game. And again, this is like a little bit of power structure going on. A man showing up to work in the woman's game probably isn't worrying about sexual assault and sexual harassment. And the people hiring him on aren't worrying about that with him being in those roles. And more than likely, there's, all of the bathrooms are accessible to him in some capacity. I think this is like an interesting sort of comparison side to side because
it's a good point.
It's a very different experience.
It's a really good point. And to speak to the complex biopsychosocial phenomena, if I was to and have volunteered my labor to a female team, mainly on a tournament level, is the example I'm thinking about. Is that as I'm 6'4", about 100 kg, and the last thing on my mind for biopsychosocial reasons in a changing room or therapy room full of the female athletes would be that risk, my physical risk. Whereas
it's about safety, right?
And that safety needs to be paramount. And the complex phenomena that is underneath that is something that is inherently gendered. And sexuality, as you've mentioned, overlaps with that. And so it's why it's messy, isn't it? That's why we can't be, it's ridiculous for anyone that's biologically reductionist. But then it's also, if we just infer that this is an disembodied sociological analysis, I think we miss something too, right? So thank you so much for wading through this complex stuff together for a little bit. I want to come back therefore to that question I mentioned, and I know we have not got as much time as we need for it, but maybe that precedes another conversation if you fancy. Do you think that we can move the needle in our space without really those bigger picture features falling into place as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been proof in the pudding in ways. At least in professional sports, it seems like even just having conversations is bringing more women into the fold, or at least creating an awareness about it and how can we correct it. And to be fair, I think the Black Lives Matter movement has been a great help to awareness on discrimination and bias. And so we really need to credit every activist out there that speaks up on these issues, because it helps to push the needle and gives the people in positions of power maybe something to consider and think about. And at the same time, I think that without the accountability piece, the accountability being policies in place that help protect and keep people, protected and safe, I think it'll be an ongoing struggle to get it equal, and I don't know that it'll ever be equal, and I don't know that, I'm under the pretense that equality is the goal necessarily, but
well, you can imagine, we can all imagine a dystopian world in which you get statistical equality or equity that therefore hasn't righted some of the wrongs that we've been describing, because it's arbitrary, rather than thinking carefully about some of those barriers and some of the overt and covert discrimination that's occurring. Thank you so much for your time, especially with the time. For those that are just tuning in, this is like now just about 5 a.m. for Ellie, so I can't believe she's giving us our time
so
today.
Fresh.
I can't believe how well you've done. I'd be so groggy if I was at 5 a.m. Although I was up at 5 a.m. for different reasons with my wailing twins, but that's a different thing. I won't whinge about that today, maybe on tomorrow's show. There's a really interesting point that I just want to flag here, because it's no doubt a conversation that I could have with Jem and others, is protecting a male therapist in a female world for so many other reasons is also paramount. For some of the reasons you've mentioned, Jack. Agree, Jem, and I definitely would love to speak about that further. I think one of the things that I want to make sure on, though, is that the reputational risk in safety for a male therapist in that circumstance, fine, but I would always put that behind the very real physical safety risk on the flip side. That's one of the reasons I wasn't trying to demean some of the other risks that can occur there, but in terms of the physical safety element that I think can sometimes be gendered there, that's where I was doubling down on. But Jem's right to flag the fact that on the flip side, this shit's messy, right? So let's be mature about it. And thank you so much, Ellie, for joining me today. I can't believe that we've been able to have the time to do it. We've covered a lot of ground in half an hour. Could you just point out to people where they can find you on social media, and we'll get stuck into this hopefully again in another time?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Dr. Ellie Somers and Instagram at the Sisu Wolf. And then on my website, which is the www.sisuwolf.com. Fantastic.
Well, thanks a lot. We'll post some links to those in the discussion forums and chat functions. But yeah, hopefully I won't commit you to another episode right now. But this has definitely been something that I've really enjoyed, and I think that having these conversations as bravely as we can, and showing that they don't have to be fraught with confrontation, I think is useful. And I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me. It was great to be here.
Nice one. Now, normally I would blare out some really cool graphics, and we would escape into the background behind a really fancy video, but the video's not working. So me and Ellie are just going to nervously wave until the stream ends. Bye.